The wind descended from the high timber with a voice that spoke of ancient winters, an unforgiving cold driving snow horizontally across the ridge trail above Snow Peak. It was the manner of blizzard that consumed the world, entire erasing boundaries between earth and sky, transforming familiar landmarks into spectral suggestions, glimpsed and lost in the same heartbeat, burying fence posts until a man might stride over them without knowing human hands had ever touched this wilderness. The settlement cowered in the lee of a granite shoulder thrust up from the earth's bones millennia ago, its scattered buildings reduced to flickering points of amber lamplight, barely visible through the white maelstrom pouring down from mountain heights as though winter itself had declared war upon all living things. On the settlement's easternmost fringe, where homesteads thinned to isolated outposts and the wilderness pressed its eternal claim with patient inevitability, a single cabin stood half entombed in accumulating drifts that climbed its log walls like frozen waves caught in the moment before breaking. One lantern burned upon the narrow porch, a solitary defiant star against the encroaching darkness that seemed to possess substance and weight, darkness that pressed against that small circle of light as though seeking to extinguish it through sheer, overwhelming presence. Coda emerged from the timber, astride a spotted pony whose breath created clouds of vapor that the wind tore away before they could dissipate naturally. His buffalo robe was drawn tight about his shoulders, and his war bonnet lay wrapped in oiled cloth tucked carefully in his saddlebag. He was Lakota, a warrior, though that word carried less weight than it once had, its meaning eroded by defeat and displacement, until it described more a memory than a present reality. The long conflicts were finished, his people driven northward into agencies and reservations or scattered like autumn leaves before a prairie gale that showed no mercy. He dwelt now in the margins between worlds, guiding freight wagons through mountain passes the white settlers had not yet mapped, hunting for camps that would trade venison for powder, keeping his braids and his silence in town. Because words could be as dangerous as drawn weapons. He had intended merely to pass through Snow Peak before the storm sealed the ridge entirely. But as his pony picked its cautious way along the icy track, he detected something that caused him to draw rein with sudden urgency. A child's voice, high and thin and desperate, as a wounded animal's cry calling into the storm's throat. He turned his mount toward the cabin. Drawing nearer through the white curtain, he perceived her at last, a little girl standing upon the porch in a red wool dress, barefoot in snow, already drifting across the weathered boards, clutching a straw doll against her narrow chest as though it were the last solid thing in a world dissolving into white chaos. Her hair shone pale as corn silk, tangled and dampened by blown snow beginning to freeze in the strands. She trembled in the gale like a young sapling on the verge of snapping, her small silhouette etched in heartbreaking clarity against the warm radiance spilling from the open door behind her, warmth she stood outside of as though waiting had become its own kind of penance. When she marked his emergence from the white void, she did not flee, though every story she had ever heard screamed at her to run. She merely stared with eyes too large in her thin face, her breath emerging in rapid gasps that condensed to vapor and vanished instantly. Coda dismounted with deliberate slowness, each movement calculated to convey peaceful intent to a child who had surely heard tales of warriors and violence. He advanced on foot, and the warm light from the open door haloed the child in gold that seemed to emphasize rather than diminish her vulnerability. "Mama promised to come home Christmas Eve," she whispered when he drew close enough to hear her voice fracturing on the words, like river ice in spring thaw. "She promised me. She said she would come home before dark. But she didn't come." Coda's gaze swept the yard with practiced assessment. Wolf tracks inscribed the fresh snow in a wide arc that approached dangerously near the cabin's perimeter. The woodpile beside the structure was nearly exhausted, perhaps a day's worth if burned carefully. No other boot prints marred the snow's surface beyond the child's small tracks, no indication that another human being had approached this isolated place for hours, perhaps days. He knelt upon one knee, bringing his weathered face level with hers. "She'll come back," he said quietly, his voice pitched low and steady, carrying absolute conviction. "First, you must go inside before the cold takes you." The girl hesitated, her gaze flickering between his braids and his high cheekbones, the copper tone of his skin. He could observe the battle waging across her young face, fear born of every story she had absorbed, fighting against the immediate reality that she was freezing, that she was alone, that this stranger represented her only prospect of surviving the night. Coda extended one gloved hand palm upward and waited with the patience of mountains that had stood 10,000 winters. After a protracted interval that seemed to dilate into something approaching eternity, the girl placed her small hand in his. Her fingers felt like ice even through his thick glove, and he could detect violent tremors coursing through her diminutive frame, the dangerous stage when extremities began to freeze and core temperature dropped toward levels incompatible with life. He led her across the threshold into marginal warmth and closed the door against winter's assault. The fire had burned down to embers that glowed dully in the stone hearth, providing almost no heat. Coda moved immediately to address the most urgent need, kneeling before the hearth and beginning the careful work of resurrection. He added wood from the meager pile with practiced efficiency, coaxing flames back from the embers with handfuls of dry bark, blowing gently to provide oxygen without scattering the precious heat. Small flames licked upward tentatively, gradually building until they possessed sufficient strength to consume the larger split logs. As warmth gradually began spreading through the frigid space, he conducted a methodical inventory. The pantry revealed conditions that spoke of poverty grinding toward destitution, several shriveled potatoes, a strip of bacon gone hard with age, a handful of flour contaminated with weevils. One window was shattered, stuffed with rags that had frozen solid, providing essentially no insulation. Wind whistled through gaps, carrying snow that had begun accumulating on the interior sill. Coda pulled boards from the woodpile and nailed them across the broken window, each hammer blow echoing in the small space. When he finished, the draft that had been steadily draining warmth diminished noticeably, and the fire's heat began to accumulate. He showed the girl Hattie. He would learn her name was how to wedge a chair beneath the door latch to keep wolves out, how to cock the rifle that stood beside the door, how to brace the heavy weapon to absorb recoil. His movements throughout were calm and instructive, treating her as a person capable of learning rather than a helpless child to be coddled. And something in her expression shifted marginally. Not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of recognition that perhaps this stranger meant what his actions suggested. A sudden hammering at the door caused them both to start. The voice that penetrated the thick wood was anxious, heavily accented. "Hazel Hattie, are you inside there? Please, you must answer if you are safe." Dietrich, a German homesteader who maintained a hardscrabble farm a mile down the ridge, a man Coda recognized as honest and fair. When Coda opened the door, Dietrich's weathered face drained of color. He raised his rifle with shaking hands, the barrel wavering uncertainly. "Step away from that child." He commanded, his English thick with accent and rising panic. Hattie launched herself between them, her small arms spreading wide. "No, don't hurt him. He saved me. I was freezing and he made fire, and he showed me how to keep wolves away." The barrel wavered more violently as Dietrich stared at Coda, then at the girl, then back again. Slowly, with visible effort, he lowered the rifle. "Where is Hazel?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "The girl's mother, where is she?" "Gone to Ghost Creek with Roman Doherty yesterday." Coda replied, his tone flat. "She has not returned as she promised the child." Dietrich's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering. "That man is poison," he spat with vehemence. "Poison Pete, some call him. If Hazel went with him in this storm, if she is at Ghost Creek." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. They attempted to leave, despite the storm's fury, Dietrich insisting they could reach his farm. They hitched his draft horse to his wagon, loaded Hattie wrapped in every available blanket, and set forth into the blizzard's teeth. The journey nearly killed them all. The third time the wagon lurched sickeningly, the ground gave way beneath the right rear wheel without warning, the snow-crusted embankment collapsing to reveal a drop of perhaps 20 feet onto rocks that would shatter bone and wagon both. Dietrich hauled on the reins with all his strength, shouting in German. Coda dove for the wagon tongue, and for a terrifying interval he was being dragged forward by forces beyond his power to resist. He could feel the ground fragmenting beneath his feet, could perceive the black void opening before him, could hear Hattie screaming. Then Dietrich was there, seizing Coda by the collar and hauling him backward with desperate strength. Together, they threw their combined weight against the wagon until the wheels found solid ground again. They sat in the snow afterward, gasping, shaking, staring at each other, with the wide eyes of men who had just gazed into death's face. "We cannot travel in this," Dietrich admitted hoarsely. "We will die before we reach anywhere safe, and the child will die with us." They returned to the cabin, barred themselves inside, and settled in to wait for dawn. First light arrived gray and bitter, the blizzard having eased marginally. Coda refused absolutely to leave Hattie unprotected. He secured her to the saddle before him, wrapping her in blankets and tucking his buffalo robe over both their shoulders, sharing warmth not from sentiment, but from survival necessity. Dietrich followed on his own horse, their small procession moving with painful slowness through the transformed landscape. The ride down to Snow Peak was brutal beyond description. Frost formed on Hattie's lashes. Her breath came in shallow gasps that Coda monitored constantly. He shared his warmth with her, his body heat and the buffalo robe creating a pocket where survival remained possible. He felt every shiver that coursed through her small frame, felt the gradual cessation of trembling as his warmth penetrated. They reached the frozen creek that bisected the trail. Coda walked ahead slowly, using his spear's haft to test each step, listening to the ice's response. They were nearly across when Hattie's pony suddenly balked and lunged forward in panic. The ice fractured with a sound like a rifle shot cracks radiating outward, and then the sheet collapsed. The pony plunged through into water so cold it screamed, and Coda lunged without thought, grabbing Hattie even as the pony thrashed. They went into the water together, and the cold was beyond anything language could adequately convey. It was not merely cold, but a physical force that seemed to stop his heart, that drove air from his lungs, that sent every muscle into spasm. The water was waist deep, but the current was stronger than it appeared, pulling at his legs. He kept his grip on Hattie, kept her head above water, even as his body screamed that he was dying. Dietrich threw himself flat on solid ice, reaching out with the spear shaft. Coda grasped it with one hand while maintaining his grip on Hattie with the other, and Dietrich hauled them toward the edge. They got the pony out too somehow, all of them soaked and shaking uncontrollably. Coda's mind, even through shock and cold, began calculating. They were perhaps 2 miles from Snow Peak, still too far to reach before hypothermia claimed them. He scanned the landscape and spotted what he needed: a rock overhang that would block wind and reflect heat. Dietrich immediately began gathering wood. Coda stripped Hattie's wet clothing, wrapped her in the buffalo robe, and held her against his bare chest so his body heat could reach her directly. Her lips had turned blue, her skin white as snow, and she was barely conscious. "Stay awake," he commanded harshly. "Hattie, look at me. Your mother needs you to stay awake." Her eyes opened slightly at mention of her mother. Dietrich got the fire started, coaxing flames from wet wood through determination. They stripped their own wet outer clothing and hung everything around the fire, steam rising immediately. They huddled close to the flames, feeding it continuously, gradually feeling warmth return in painful stages. When their clothes had dried enough to wear, they continued toward Snow Peak with renewed caution but undiminished determination. They arrived at midday, and Miss Caroline, the schoolteacher, who had been watching anxiously from the window, immediately took charge of Hattie. It was here that Sheriff Humphrey entered the story, and everything shifted. They found him at his office, a solid man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and a manner that projected competent authority. When they explained the situation, Hazel's disappearance, Roman's involvement, their suspicions about Ghost Creek, he listened with apparent grave concern. "This is a serious matter," he said slowly, his face creased with what appeared genuine worry. "Roman Doherty is a prominent businessman, that's true, but the law applies to everyone equally. If he's holding Mrs. Brennan against her will, if there's any impropriety in how those guardianship papers were executed, then it's my duty to investigate, regardless of his position." He stood and retrieved his coat. "I'll accompany you to Ghost Creek myself. We'll need a legitimate reason to be on the property. Dr. Thomas could come along under pretense of delivering medicine to the workers that would give us legal grounds." Coda studied the sheriff carefully, searching for any hint of deception, but Humphrey's demeanor seemed entirely sincere. His body language was open, his eyes met Coda's directly. "I know there's bad history between your people and mine." Humphrey continued addressing Coda directly with what seemed like genuine respect. "I won't pretend otherwise. But when it comes to protecting women and children from men who abuse power, I don't care about a man's race. I care about what's right. Will you ride with me?" It was exactly what Coda had hoped to hear, yet something whispered caution. But what choice did he have? "I will ride with you." Coda agreed, noting how Humphrey's eyes briefly flickered with an emotion he could not quite identify, before the sheriff smiled. They assembled their group and set out for Ghost Creek. During the journey, Humphrey conversed amiably with Dr. Thomas about legal complexities, expressing what sounded like genuine concern about potential loopholes that unscrupulous men might exploit. He spoke thoughtfully about the need for reform, about his frustration with a system that sometimes protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. His performance was masterful. Even Coda's suspicions began to ease under the accumulated weight of Humphrey's apparent sincerity. Ghost Creek materialized through falling snow, like a vision of hell rendered in wood and iron, high wooden fences, topped with sharpened stakes, guard towers at corners, locked barracks with barred windows, armed men patrolling with military precision. The foreman who met them was a burly man named Cole, with a scarred face and cold eyes. His hand rested on his revolver as he examined their group with suspicion. "State your business," he demanded bluntly. Humphrey urged his horse forward, his badge gleaming. "Official business, Cole. Dr. Thomas brought medicine for the men, heard there was fever going through the camp. And I'm conducting a routine inspection. Territorial law requires it. I'm sure Mr. Doherty won't object to cooperating with the law." Something passed across Cole's features, a flicker of recognition that registered in Coda's awareness like a warning bell. "Wait here. I'll inform Mr. Doherty." During this interval, while the guards were momentarily distracted, Coda slipped away with movements so fluid they seemed like vapor. He located a section where boards had warped, squeezed through, and ghosted toward the main office building. A window hung slightly ajar, and Coda pulled himself through, dropping silently into Roman's office. The office radiated wealth, warm from a coal stove, furnished with an expensive desk and leather chairs, walls lined with maps and official documents. Coda began his search with methodical precision, employing skills learned from tracking prey that did not wish to be found. The desk's surface was too neat, too carefully arranged, like a stage set. The drawers yielded nothing immediately incriminating. But his instincts insisted something was wrong. He knelt examining the floor with the same intensity he would bring to reading tracks. There, near the corner beneath a heavy trunk, several floorboards showed faint marks around their edges, barely visible even to trained eyes. The marks formed a pattern that spoke of repeated disturbance. The trunk itself showed corresponding wear patterns, indicating it had been shifted repeatedly, despite appearing permanent. Coda moved it with agonizing slowness, lifting rather than sliding to prevent sound. Beneath it, one board had been cut and fitted back with such precision it was nearly invisible, secured by a simple latch hidden in the gap between planks. He triggered the latch and lifted the board. In the cavity beneath lay a leather-bound ledger and a stack of official documents. Coda extracted both and opened the ledger, and the world seemed to tilt beneath him. It was not a business record, but a ledger of the trade in women rendered in meticulous detail. Women's names filled the pages in neat columns. Beside each name, age, physical descriptions detailed like livestock notes on temperament that spoke of broken spirits and a price. Mary Sullivan, 24, strong-build, docile, 150. Catherine O'Brien, 19, literate, some resistance, 200. Hazel Brennan, 28, widow, strong, literate, suitable for Eastern resale, 200. The notations continued with chilling precision, dates of acquisition, methods to secure cooperation, destinations for transport, names of buyers in Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco. And throughout it all, the signatures, Roman Doherty's flowing script, and beneath it, repeatedly, Sheriff Humphrey's bold hand with his badge number written beside it, like an official seal. The sheriff was not merely aware of the operation. He was Roman's full partner, had been for years using his badge to provide the legal framework that made the entire enterprise possible. As this realization crystallized, Coda heard boots on the porch. He quickly replaced the board, slid the trunk back, and tucked the ledger inside his shirt. He moved toward the window, just as the office door opened. Roman entered, flanked by 4 armed men. Behind them, lounging in the doorway with satisfied triumph, stood Sheriff Humphrey. His earlier friendliness had evaporated, entirely replaced by cold calculation. Well, Roman said conversationally. A thief and a fool who believed Humphrey's performance. I thought perhaps he was overselling the Concerned Lawman Act, but apparently you savages are even more gullible than I credited. Humphrey stepped forward, his hand on his gun. Did you really imagine I would help you? He asked mockingly. I've been partners with Roman for 5 years. Your people were always too trusting once someone spoke the right words. You hear talk about law and justice, and you want so desperately to believe it that you ignore evidence suggesting otherwise. He smiled without warmth. I knew from the moment you walked into my office that you suspected something. So I became your ally, gained your trust, and led you exactly where Roman and I wanted you into custody. Coda's hand moved toward his knife, but 4 guns were trained on him. Where is Hazel Brennan? Already departed for the rail spur at Rock Creek. Roman replied with satisfaction. By tomorrow, she'll be on an eastbound train. As for you and your meddling friends, you're all under arrest for trespassing, theft, and assault. Through the window, Coda could see the others being seized. Dr. Thomas's face showed blood. Dietrich was cursing in German. Caroline struggled until restrained, and Hattie was screaming for her mother. You're all witnesses to attempted robbery, Humphrey announced with theatrical formality. I'll have the charges drawn up proper and legal. Roman's smile was cold as winter death. There's an old trapper's lodge up by the river bend. Lock them there while we finish our holiday business. When we return, we'll determine whether they're worth a trial or whether they'll simply disappear. Coda met Humphrey's eyes directly. This is not finished, he said quietly. Humphrey laughed. Can't it be you're a savage? Most would prefer dead regardless. The German farmer is a drunk. The school teacher is hysterical. Everyone knows how women see conspiracies. The doctor has laudanum problems, and the child orphans disappear all the time. They were thrown into a wagon and driven through the resuming storm to the lodge. Humphrey, riding alongside his badge, catching light the ultimate symbol of law, corrupted beyond recognition. The old trapper's lodge crouched against the mountainside, its roof sagging under snow's weight. They were thrown inside the door, slamming with finality. Inside, they found a cast-iron stove, a half-sack of contaminated oats, and broken furniture. Coda set to work immediately, freeing his bound hands with Dietrich's help. He fed the stove with broken furniture, arranging fuel with practiced efficiency, striking sparks with flint until one caught. The fire established itself gradually warmth, pushing back the killing cold. The two women from Ghost Creek, Ida and Charlotte, huddled near the growing warmth, their eyes hollow. They had been there for months. They whispered, brought under false promises, gradually realizing they were prisoners. Their cart, Thomas paced like a caged animal. "I should have acted years ago," he muttered repeatedly. "I knew something was wrong. I treated the evidence. But I told myself there was nothing I could do. My cowardice has cost lives." Caroline sat with Hattie, tears sliding down her cheeks, her broken spectacles clutched in her hand. Her faith in systems lay as shattered as her spectacles. Hattie suddenly turned on Coda with raw fury. "You lied," she shouted. "You promised Mama would come back. You said you'd bring her home, but she's gone and we're locked up and it's your fault. You promised and you lied." Each word landed like a physical blow. The accusations weren't fair in any objective sense. Yet they were also completely fair because his power had proven insufficient. He knelt before her. "I will bring her back," he said, his voice rough. "I promise you, Hattie. I will bring your mother back or die attempting it." "Promises don't mean anything." Hattie spat through tears. "Grown-ups say things, but they don't mean them." She collapsed into sobs, and Coda remained kneeling the child's words, echoing alongside memories of his sister's death, of all the times he had been unable to save those who depended on him. Dr. Thomas pulled Coda to his feet and examined the bullet graze on his shoulder from their earlier confrontation. The wound had reopened. Thomas cleaned it with whiskey that burned like liquid fire, and then began closing it with neat sutures, while Coda gripped the table until his knuckles whitened. That night, Coda read aloud from the stolen ledger by firelight, wanting everyone to understand exactly what they were fighting against. Names filled the pages: Mary Sullivan, Catherine O'Brien, dozens of others, each representing a woman reduced to a commodity. Dates of acquisition, methods employed, destinations, buyers' names, and throughout the signatures confirming conspiracy, Romans and Humphreys. When he finished, silence filled the lodge except for the fire's crackle. Even the guards outside had fallen quiet. Hattie slowly crossed the space between them and took Coda's hand without speaking. She held on as exhaustion dragged him toward fitful sleep. Dawn arrived gray and bitter, the storm having moved through. Through gaps in the walls, Coda could see fresh snow had fallen. He had slept perhaps an hour, his mind too active. He woke the others and was adding the last furniture to the stove when he heard horses approaching, many of them. Roman's riders surrounded the lodge with military precision. They dismounted and took positions, rifles trained on the building. Roman himself remained mounted at a safe distance, Humphrey beside him. "We're out of time," Coda said quietly. "They've come to finish what they started. We can wait here and die, or we can run and possibly survive." "Run where?" Dietrich asked. "They have horses." "I know this country," Coda replied. "I know where the land will support us, but not horses where trees grow close enough to prevent mounted pursuit. Our chances are not good, but they are better than remaining here." The first shot came without warning, punching through a gap and showering splinters. More shots followed a concentrated barrage. Coda returned fire through a gap, aiming not to hit, but to make them keep distance. Then, a bottle arced through the air, crashing through a window. Flames erupted as lamp oil spread across dry wood, climbing the interior wall with terrifying speed. Heat built rapidly, smoke filling the space. They had minutes before the building became a death trap. Coda kicked out the stove's back panel, creating a sudden opening. The draft pulled flames sideways toward the new oxygen source, rather than spreading throughout the interior. "Everyone out the back now," he shouted. He grabbed a smoldering piece of furniture and kicked through the weak point in the rear wall he had identified. He shoved Hattie through first, then helped Ida and Charlotte. Caroline, Dr. Thomas, and Dietrich followed, then Coda himself. During the night, he had braided strips torn from their clothing into a crude rope. He tied one end to Hattie's waist, the other to his own, organizing them into a line. "Follow exactly where I step," he commanded. "Do not deviate. Some snow will hold you, some will not, and only I can tell the difference." He led them into the trees at a run, moving through snow that varied from ankle-deep to mid-thigh. Behind them, shouts erupted as Roman's men realized their prey had escaped. The forest swallowed them, and Coda, navigated by instincts honed over a lifetime, reading the land's subtle language, understanding how snow accumulated differently, knowing where fallen logs created invisible bridges. They reached the wooden bridge over the frozen river, the only crossing for miles. As they stumbled onto the bridge approach, a sleigh burst from the far side. Roman sat at the reins, his face contorted with fury. Humphrey occupied the seat beside him, clutching a shotgun. Several armed men crouched in the rear. And lashed to the sleigh with rope that had cut into her flesh was Hazel. Her face bore fresh bruises layered over older ones. Her lip was split so badly the gash extended into her cheek. One eye was swollen shut. Her hands were bound so tightly her fingers had darkened to purple. She was barely conscious. Then Hazel saw Hattie through her one functioning eye, and something shifted in her battered face. She let out a sound that was half sob, half animal cry, muffled by the gag, but still heartbreaking. "Mama." Hattie screamed, lunging forward. Coda caught her holding her back, even as she struggled and wept. Roman raised a pistol, pressing it against Hazel's temple, hard enough to indent her skin. The ledger for the woman and child, simple exchange. The townspeople who had followed the sounds of gunfire had gathered at both ends of the bridge, perhaps 20 people, their faces expressing confusion and uncertainty. Coda released Hattie into Caroline's arms and walked forward, descending to the ice below. He laid the ledger on a flat rock where everyone could observe it clearly, physical proof of crimes committed under law's protection. "You speak of law," Roman called down. "We have law. The sheriff says those papers are legal. The judge's clerk stamped them. Who will anyone believe? Respected businessmen with proper documentation or a savage with stolen property?" He gestured toward Coda's braids, with exaggerated disgust, deliberately invoking every prejudice. Several in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Coda's voice when he spoke was calm and steady. "You claim ownership of these women. Come down here and prove your claim. Stand for what you assert. Face me in the open." It was a challenge no man like Roman could refuse before witnesses. His face flushed with rage, and he dismounted awkwardly, his expensive boots slipping on ice before he caught his balance. Humphrey, sensing an opportunity to maintain his facade, ordered everyone to stand back. "Fair fight. Let them settle it according to frontier justice. I'll judge the outcome." The wind howled across the frozen river, and for a brief moment the snow eased enough that everyone could observe clearly. Two men stood facing each other on the ice, their shadows long in weak winter light. The assembled crowd fell silent. Roman drew first exactly as Coda had anticipated. The revolver barked. Coda dropped to one knee and felt the bullet tear a burning groove across his already wounded shoulder. White-hot agony exploded through his body, his vision graying. Blood sprayed in an arc that looked black against white snow. But iron discipline kept him moving. He fired back and saw Roman stagger as the bullet grazed his ribs. Roman closed the distance, swinging the revolver like a club when Coda's rifle jammed. The heavy metal crashed into Coda's forearm, and he heard something crack, definitely bone. His hand went numb, and the rifle fell to slide across the ice. They grappled two men locked in Mortal Kombat boots, slipping on treacherous surface. Roman was larger, heavier, fighting with desperate strength. Coda was wounded in multiple places, the shoulder bleeding freely. The arm likely fractured exhaustion from days of insufficient food and sleep. He operated on will alone and memories of everyone he had failed to save. But Coda possessed what Roman did not intimate: knowledge of the natural world, the ability to read ice and current. He had been observing since they arrived, noting subtle variations, differences in color and texture, the way snow sat differently on areas of varying thickness patterns that spoke of current flowing beneath. There, 10 feet distant, a patch of darker ice, where the river narrowed and current ran faster where the surface was thinner. It was marked by a subtle difference, visible only to trained eyes. With his last reserves of strength, Coda hooked his leg behind Roman's knee, with a technique his father had taught him. He used the man's momentum and greater weight against him, twisting and shoving, guiding their stumbling path toward that patch of weaker ice with precision. They stumbled together, and Coda felt the precise moment when Roman's boot came down on the weaker section. The ice gave a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, a sound that carried across the expanse and made everyone catch their breath. The sound hung in cold air for a suspended moment, and then the ice spiderwebbed. Cracks radiated outward in a complex network, and then the section collapsed completely with a sound like breaking glass, magnified 1,000 times. Roman plunged through into black water with a shriek of pure terror. The river was perhaps 5 feet deep, but the current was powerful, and the cold was instantly lethal. Water this cold stopped the heart-paralyzed muscles. Roman's arms flailed desperately, grasping for anything, his fingers clawing at ice that broke away in his hands. His mouth opened in a scream that turned to gurgling as water filled it, as the cold shocked his system into paralysis. The current pulled him sideways with inexorable force. It dragged him under the thicker ice downstream where there was no possibility of escape. His head surfaced once more, 20 feet distant, eyes bulging with terrible knowledge of approaching death. And then he was gone. The current pulled him under and away, and he vanished into the black water and eternal cold. Coda had thrown himself backward at the final instant, landing hard on solid ice that groaned but held. Pain exploded through his injured shoulder and fractured arm with force that tore a cry from his throat. He lay gasping, blood soaking through his clothing and beginning to freeze, staring at the jagged hole where Roman had vanished. No one on the banks moved to help Roman. No man was willing to risk that dark water now that they had witnessed its lethal power. On the bridge, Hazel acted with desperate courage. She slammed her bound hands backward into the guard, holding her, driving her knuckles into his face. Blood exploded from his nostrils, and he released her. She fell to the planks, but immediately began rolling toward the dropped pistol. Hattie darted forward like a striking snake, biting the hand of another guard. He yelped and jerked away. The girl scrambled past him, running to her mother. In the chaos, Dietrich and Charlotte seized, dropped weapons, turning guns on Roman's remaining men, who froze, their courage evaporating. Humphrey, watching everything fall apart, began shouting desperately. "Murder that savage killed a respectable businessman. This is why we need law and order." Roman was operating under proper legal authority. His papers were in order. Caroline, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly moved with decisive action. She climbed onto the wagon tongue so everyone could see her clearly, and she began reading from the ledger in a voice that rang with fury that would not be silenced. She read names and ages and prices with deliberate precision. She read physical descriptions that reduced women to catalog entries. She read notes on temperament that spoke of broken spirits. She read destinations and dates. She read buyer names and addresses establishments everyone had heard whispers about. And she read the signatures that appeared throughout Romans and Humphreys, with his badge number written beside it like authority's blessing. The faces in the crowd transformed as she read. Mackenzie, the rancher, whose cousin Mary had disappeared 3 years ago, recognized her name listed with a price of $150, marked as Transported St. Louis, March 1852. Mrs. Chen saw her sister-in-law's name, Lee May Chen, age 21, transported San Francisco, September 1853, $175. Names upon names, each representing a life destroyed, while law had looked away or actively enabled the destruction. Humphrey reached for his gun with desperate speed. Dr. Thomas, who had spent years avoiding violence, swung the shovel he had been holding, bringing it down on Humphrey's arm. Metal met bone with a crack audible across the expanse. Humphrey's gun discharged harmlessly skyward as his arm broke. He dropped the weapon and stumbled. Dietrich and 2 miners tackled Humphrey into the snow, wrestling him down with righteous anger, wrenching away his badge and binding his arms with harness straps pulled tight enough to bite into flesh. One miner, a man named Collins, whose daughter had vanished 4 years ago, stood over Humphrey with tears streaming down his face. "My Katie," he said, his voice breaking. "She was 16. You told me she'd gone east to work in a dress shop, but she's in that book. You helped sell my daughter like livestock, and then you looked me in the eye and lied." Humphrey said nothing, his face gone pale. No cavalry arrived to rescue them. No federal marshal appeared. No higher power descended. It was their own courage, their own voices, their own willingness to stand and fight that ended Roman's empire and dragged Humphrey's corruption into daylight. The storm, as though waiting for resolution, finally broke completely. Clouds parted to reveal pale sun that transformed the landscape into something almost beautiful. White expanses glittering with ice crystals the world cleansed. Hazel, freed from her bonds, knelt beside Coda where he had collapsed. She supported his back with her body despite her own injuries, her hand pressing against his chest over his heart, feeling it beat. Dr. Thomas worked with field efficiency, packing the shoulder wound, binding it tightly, splinting the fractured arm. "You need a hospital," Thomas said bluntly. "You're going to lose significant function if you don't get proper care." "I will have function enough," Coda replied through gritted teeth. "Enough for what needs doing." Hazel wrapped a blanket around his shoulders with shaking hands that remained gentle. She said nothing. Words seemed inadequate, but her eyes met his with an expression that contained everything language couldn't convey. Gratitude, respect, recognition of something deeper growing between them. Hattie threw herself at Coda, clinging to him despite his injuries. "You kept your promise," she whispered against his neck. "You said Mama would come back, and you brought her back. Even when it hurt you. Even when you almost died." In the weeks that followed, a delegation traveled to the territorial capital with meticulous preparation. The journey required 5 days through snow and mud. Miss Caroline led them, organizing evidence with methodical precision. She had cataloged every page of the ledger, created indices, prepared summaries. Dr. Thomas brought medical records maintained over years, detailed notes on women he had treated, injuries he had known were not accidents, but had lacked courage to report. These records provided corroborating evidence, matching entries in the ledger. They brought sworn statements from Ida Charlotte and 6 other women who had escaped Ghost Creek over the years. These women's testimony was powerful because it was consistent different women from different backgrounds. Yet their stories followed the same pattern. They brought Romans' correspondence with Eastern buyers' letters discussing inventory and stock with casual efficiency. And they brought Hazel her face still bearing visible bruises, her testimony delivered in a steady voice, describing the guardianship papers she had signed, believing they would protect her property, about how they had instead stripped her of all legal rights. The territorial judge who heard their presentation was Judge Blackwood, possessed of white whiskers and a reputation for harsh sentences, but also incorruptibility. He listened in growing silence, his face darkening progressively. "How long?" he asked finally. "How long has this been operating?" "At least 6 years," Caroline answered. "Possibly longer. Based on conversations with escaped women, we believe perhaps a decade." "A decade," Blackwood repeated the word, an indictment. "A decade of women bought and sold while a badge supposedly sworn to protect them enabled it." He removed Humphrey from office, immediately ordered him held without bond, awaiting trial on charges including conspiracy trafficking, corruption of documents, bribery, extortion, and accessory to assault. His property was seized by the court and would likely be sold for victim compensation. "You've done what law enforcement should have done years ago," Blackwood told them. "You have my gratitude and my apology. I'm ordering a territorial investigation into how official seals were obtained and misused, and into reforms needed to prevent such corruption." It was not perfect justice. Roman had died without trial. Humphrey would likely receive a lighter sentence than deserved. Some women were lost beyond recovery. The Eastern buyers would probably never face consequences. But it was more than most women received. It was acknowledgement that crimes had been committed. It was validation that their suffering mattered. It was proof that even corrupted systems could be forced toward justice when ordinary people refused to accept evil as inevitable. Spring came late that year, but when thaw arrived, it came with sudden warmth. Snow melted into rushing streams. Grass emerged impossibly green. Trees budded, birds returned with song, and the world turned from death to life. Ghost Creek changed hands, sold under strict conditions. New owners agreed to hire a matron, pay fair wages, provide safe housing, permit workers to leave whenever they chose. It remained hard work, but women worked by choice, could terminate employment without fearing pursuit, received wages actually earned. Some women left on eastbound trains with their settlements starting fresh where no one knew their stories. Others stayed using settlement money to purchase small plots where they could farm or operate businesses. A cluster of homesteads developed on the eastern ridge, women helping each other, building community, defined by mutual support rather than male authority. Hazel received clean title to her cabin and $300. She replaced her roof, purchased a cow, and hens paid Caroline to tutor Hattie, stocked her pantry properly, and bought her daughter boots that fit and a warm coat. Coda recovered slowly at Dietrich's farm, and the injuries proving more serious than initially assessed. The shoulder wound became infected, requiring excruciating debridement. The fractured arm healed imperfectly, leaving permanent limitations. For weeks he lay in fever, while Dietrich's wife tended him. When he could finally sit upright, he told Dietrich he would return north to his people. But Hazel began visiting, bringing bread and preserved foods medicines. At first, the visits were brief and formal. Gradually, they lengthened. Conversations extended beyond courtesy. They talked about practical matters, the shared language of survival. Which trails flooded, how to distinguish wolf howls, where to find good clay, for chinking how to preserve meat. But slowly, they began sharing more personal matters. Hazel spoke about her husband, a good man, but careless. Coda spoke about his sister, about years of wandering about, no longer knowing where he belonged. One afternoon, while installing warning bells around her cabin, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same anchor point. The contact was brief, accidental. Yet they both froze. For a suspended moment, neither moved. Then, instead of jerking apart, they adjusted slightly, fingers fitting together, sharing the task and the touch in a gesture that acknowledged without declaring. Neither mentioned it afterward. Neither needed to. But something shifted. By the following winter, an arrangement had formed, unspoken, but understood. Lakota maintained his cabin in the timber, but spent more time at Hazel's homestead helping with labor. She could not manage hunting, teaching Hattie skills her mother lacked. They did not marry. Legal barriers were insurmountable. Laws against miscegenation were explicit, penalties severe. To formalize their relationship would cost Hazel her property, and settlement might endanger her custody of Hattie. It would make Lakota a target for violence. So they built something quieter and potentially more enduring. They made no secret of their arrangement, but did not parade it. When questioned, Hazel said simply that Lakota was a friend who helped with the homestead. Most people chose to accept this explanation. When Hazel was 30, she gave birth to a son. The pregnancy occurred without public announcement, managed by Dr. Thomas, with Dietrich's wife attending. The boy had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. They named him James, after Hazel's father choosing an English name for practical reasons. Lakota taught his son Lakota prayers privately. Hazel taught him to read and write. James grew up learning both worlds, tracking game with his father and reading Shakespeare with his mother, learning Lakota traditions and Christian hymns. He faced prejudice constantly, but also possessed a family that had fought for its right to exist. Hattie grew into a strong young woman who never forgot the night her mother vanished and the warrior who kept his word. At 18, she became a teacher following Caroline's example. She spent her life helping children from difficult circumstances, using settlement money to establish a small school accepting all students, regardless of background. Dr. Thomas became an advocate for laws to better protect women and children, traveling repeatedly to the territorial capital pushing for reform. He did not succeed in changing much, but he tried, and his testimony prevented some abuses. Dietrich's family prospered modestly. Their friendship with Lakota became a bridge between German immigrants and Lakota families. Miss Caroline continued teaching her school, becoming known for accepting all children. She never married, pouring energy into education and activism. Snow Peak transformed gradually from rough settlement to established town. The railroad arrived, bringing commerce. The old frontier wilderness gave way to something more settled, more complex. But the story of Roman Doherty and Ghost Creek persisted as legend, a reminder that law could be corrupted, but also that ordinary people could fight back, that courage was possible, that justice occasionally prevailed. The ledger itself was preserved in the courthouse as evidence maintained where interested parties could examine it. It stood as tangible proof of documented history. New generations studied it, used it in arguments for reform, pointed to it when complacency threatened. On quiet winter evenings when snow fell soft, Lakota would sit by the fire in Hazel's cabin with her beside him and their children at the table. Sometimes he told stories of his people, the old ways fading, the hunts and ceremonies, and deep knowledge risking loss. Sometimes Hazel read from books arriving from distant cities, sharing stories that expanded horizons. The children absorbed both traditions, learning their identity didn't require choosing one or rejecting the other, that wisdom existed in multiple forms, that their mixed heritage was strength rather than compromise. And every Christmas Eve, without exception, a lantern burned on Hazel's porch throughout the night. It served as beacon against darkness, as symbol of promise, kept as light announcing home and safety and people who stood together. Neighbors could see it from miles distant on clear nights, that steady light that never wavered. And they understood what it represented, that promises mattered, and that protecting the vulnerable was everyone's responsibility, that standing against evil was not optional if civilization meant anything. Years later, when Coda was an old man whose braids had gone iron gray and Hazel's hair had turned silver, that they sat on that porch on Christmas Eve as snow fell gently. Hattie had come home with her own children, and James was there with his wife and baby daughter, 3 generations gathered. Hattie brought the old corn-husk doll Coda had crafted, carefully preserved, and placed it in her niece's hands. "This belonged to me when I was your age," she told the child. "A warrior gave it to me when he promised to bring my mama home when everything seemed lost. And he kept that promise even though it nearly killed him. Remember that when someone truly commits to help you, to protect you, to stand with you through danger that is precious beyond gold, honor it, treasure it, and someday pass it forward to someone else who needs it." The child clutched the doll without fully comprehending, but sensing through her aunt's intensity that this connected her to history larger than her small life. As family gathered inside Coda and Hazel lingered on the porch an extra moment, they stood in comfortable silence, shoulders touching with unconscious intimacy, watching snow fall on the ridge they had fought so hard to call home. "Do you ever regret it?" Hazel asked quietly. Coda considered the question with the same careful deliberation he brought to reading trails in snow. He looked at the light spilling from their cabin, heard the laughter of children and grandchildren mingling inside James's deep voice, telling a story, Hattie's measured tones, correcting some detail, the baby's delighted squeals. He studied his weathered hands, and the left one still bearing limitations from that long-ago fracture, the shoulder that ached when storms approached, permanent reminders written into flesh and bone. "Regret," he said finally. "I regret the years before, the times I remained silent when I might have spoken, the women I could not save because I lacked courage to try. I regret every moment I accepted evil as inevitable simply because fighting it seemed impossible." He turned to face her fully, and in the lantern's glow, his dark eyes held the accumulated wisdom of a life fully lived. "But this, you Hattie James, what we built together against every law and prejudice that said we should not exist, never. Not for a single heartbeat. Not even if I knew the cost beforehand, would I choose differently." Hazel's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the practiced ease of 3 decades. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears that reflected lamplight like stars. "I spent my whole life being told what I could not do, what I could not be, who I could not love," she said softly. "Society drew boundaries around me as a woman, as a widow, as someone without power. They told me my place and expected gratitude for allowing me to occupy it." She squeezed his hand tighter. "You showed me that boundaries exist only if we accept them. That promises matter more than convenience. That one person willing to stand against darkness can light enough fire to burn through years of accumulated evil. You taught me, taught all of us, that we are not helpless unless we choose to be." From inside came Hattie's voice, calling them to dinner, and they turned toward the cabin together. But Coda paused at the threshold, looking back one final time at the ridge rising into darkness, at the wilderness that had witnessed their struggle and survival, at the light from their lantern, casting its brave circle against infinite night. "This is what endures," he said more to himself than to Hazel. "Not empires or badges or documents that claim authority. Not laws that oppress or systems that crush the vulnerable. What endures is this people who choose each other, despite every force arrayed against them. Families built not on legal permission, but on loyalty proven through fire. Communities that protect their own because it is right, regardless of what is legal." He glanced at the old corn-husk doll now in his great-niece's hands, and a ghost of a smile touched his weathered features. Promises kept when keeping them costs everything. That is what endures. They stepped inside together where warmth and family waited, and behind them, the lantern continued to burn through the winter night, steady, unwavering, visible for miles across the snow-covered ridge. It burned as it had every Christmas Eve for 30 years, and as it would burn for generations after they were gone, maintained by descendants who understood what it represented. A promise kept, a light against darkness, proof that ordinary people armed with nothing but courage and determination to protect those they loved could stand against corruption, clothed in authority's robes, and prevail. And on distant ridges, in scattered cabins, where other families gathered against winter's cold, people saw that light and remembered the story. They told it to their children, and their children would tell it to theirs, the tale of a warrior who kept his word, a mother who fought for her daughter, a school teacher who refused to be silenced, a community that chose justice over convenience. The story would change with each telling as stories do. Details would blur and legends would grow. But the essential truth would remain that courage was possible, that standing together against evil mattered, that promises kept could change the world. And so the light burned on through the night and through the years, a beacon and a reminder, and a promise to all who saw it. You are not alone. Others have fought this fight before you. Others will fight it after you are gone. Stand firm, stand together, and never ever stop lighting lanterns against the dark.